I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Well, it didn't take much for William Wordsworth, perhaps the world's finest romantic poet, to get all misty-eyed and broody. Mostly it was nature that pulled at his heartstrings. On the 5th of February 1805, a tragedy struck the Wordsworth family that gutted the poet with pain, guilt and regret for the rest of his life. The Earl of Abergavenny was an East India Company trader heading out of England on an 18-month voyage to Bengal and China in search of that prize that sent Britain into raptures. Yes, he. In the ship's hold was a treasury of silver to pay for the leaves. The name of its commander? John Wordsworth, the younger brother of William the poet. The family had invested £3,000 in the Earl of Abergavenny's success, or $170,000 today. The voyage was going to make the Wordsworth family's fortune, and especially the commander's. Oh, what a rich dog they say I am to be, John Wordsworth dreamt before lifting anchor. Only fate played a different card. In heavy seas on the 5th of February 1805, the Earl of Abergavenny smacked into the Shambles Bank, a bed of shingle in the outer Weymouth roads of southern England. 6 feet of water flooded the hold. The next day the trader sank 2 miles offshore. More than 250 crew members and passengers drowned, including Commander John Wordsworth. John went down standing on a hen coop, surveying the ship and trying to save it until the bitter end. William Wordsworth was crushed. When the poet heard the terrible news, he felt as if something had been cut out of my life which cannot be restored. I shall never forget him, never lose sight of him, he wrote. There is a bond between us yet, the same as if he were living, nay, far more sacred, calling upon me to do my utmost, as he to the last did his utmost, to live in honour and worthiness. Truth be told, Wordsworth had a dirty little secret of feeling devastatingly guilty about John's death. His brother had been in love with Mary Hutchinson, the woman, oh yes, that William ended up marrying. The pair had sent each other intimate letters, with John declaring how, to be with thee, I read thy letters 12 times in a day. Then when she married William in 1802, John's lines to Mary stopped overnight. The commander never saw her again. William, fully aware of the sadness he caused his brother, was forever troubled. With John drowning so tragically on the Earl of Abergavenny, how could a sensitive poet like William Wordsworth deal with the double pain inflicted on his loving brother? William, it turns out, did more than write poems. Now a letter that the poet sent on the 13th of January 1848 to an anonymous woman from his home in the Lake District in northern England reveals an unknown side effect of the sinking of the Earl of Abergavenny and Commander John Wordsworth's death. William, we now know, started collecting antiquities from wrecks and historic ships. In the letter, Wordsworth thanks the correspondent for the presence of a box made from the timbers of the Royal George, which was a first-rate Royal Navy warship that sank off Spithead in 1782 with the loss of 900 souls and was heavily salvaged in the late 18th and early 19th century. The poet let slip that he already owned a wooden box made from the timbers of the wreck of the Royal William built in 1719, which ship remained in the service 90 years, the oldest ship on record, he says. And Wordsworth's greatest treasure was part of the very flag from the pride of the Royal Navy, the iconic HMS Victory, against which Lord Nelson reclined in death, Wordsworth shared excitedly. It was Victory that brought an English victory against France and Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 and set the stage for a Great Britain to rule the waves and the world. Huzzah! The Wordsworth letter that newly delves into the old poet's mind was discovered by Rex Cowan, an expert on all things East India, above and below the waves. Rex has spent decades exploring the wrecks of the East India Company traders, from Holland to Scotland and the Scilly Isles. The Dutch even knighted him for his services to underwater heritage. Huzzah again! Rex has found some unbelievable chunks of history and treasure, but what do these written lines mean to him? Over to you, Sir Rex. So, Rex, great to have you on the show. Tell us, when you first saw this letter, what did you think? I mean, your eyes must have jumped out on stalks.
I was amazed.
I mean, so much is known about William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, and the world thinks it's rather like Shakespeare. We know it all. But along comes this letter that no longer tells us what he feels, but what he thinks. This is a new letter that really gets us into the mind of this most famous of poets, right?
Well, in some ways, the death not only saddened him terribly, but also I think drove him a bit mad or madder.
Pushed him over the edge.
It really pushed him, and I don't think he could cope with it properly. I mean, if you look at the way that he wrote about it, he wrote about the death of his brother as a major calamity, when in fact it was something that happened quite often. Both
Right.
ships that went down and their captains with them.
Oh, but Wordsworth was a romantic poet. He felt things so much deeper than anybody else, Rex. What I thought was amazing, Rex, from this letter that you've discovered and the meaning behind it, is that John Wordsworth, he died tragically in 1805, yet this letter is written over 40 years later. So 1805 is when William Wordsworth is just starting out. You know, he's just on his journey to become the world's most famous poet. Yet 40 years later, here we are. He's still harking on. He hasn't got over his brother. So, as you say, it really was devastating.
Well, you see, Shipwreck relics talk about drama and death. And the drama is the story that goes on for a long time. And the deaths are just incidents of it. And on this occasion, both of those combined inside the mind and the heart of Wordsworth.
I wonder what a psychiatrist would say today. I mean, would they recommend to have these shipwrecked artifacts from the Royal George and the Royal William and the Victory around him every day macabre, reminding him of the death of his brother? Or maybe a psychiatrist say, listen, William, mate, go down the pub, get on the lash and just move on. I really do wonder.
What it meant, I think that the drama of the wreck and the pathos of the loss became unified psychologically in Wordsworth's mind, and it became a pillar on which he could hang a lot of his grief and work that out through associating with other people's grief as well, because all shipwreck mementos have symbolized in them not only loss, but loss of other people as well.
I can't help but think that actually he went to the grave never having made his peace with what happened.
No, that's it. And collecting relics from other shipwrecks, other loss. It all has to do with how you deal with loss. And it's obvious that he dealt immediately with it by rushing into prose and poetry. And on the long term, perhaps he became a collector of those things which symbolize not only his loss, but other people's loss as well.
You can't help but think, by having these antiquities around him on a daily basis that were pin-pricking him daily, that actually he didn't want to forget. What he really wanted to do was remember and keep John alive in his mind, I guess.
And the other thing about shipwreck recoveries now is that they are voices that speak from the depths, very often the depths of people's grief, as well as the depths of the seas in which they perished. What's been discovered from the Earl of Abergavenny is the sadness of one of England's greatest poets and the way that it affected his life. And in some ways, he sank with it.
It is amazing how, as divers, as marine archaeologists, as explorers, quite often the lowest common denominator is we're interested in stuff, whether that stuff is shiny or whether it's pottery that we find and discover on these shipwrecks. But of course, people have to remember it's about every potsherd represents and symbolizes a life. And it's about human existence, and it's about the full gamut of emotions. And, look how far the implications of this loss of John went, all the way to molding the sensibility of one of Britain's greatest poets. It is an incredible discovery. And, I'm delighted this letter now is out in the open, is exposed, and everyone can enjoy it. Well done on finding it, Rex.
Well, the discovery was an accident of mine in finding that, amazingly, that Wordsworth had engaged in the activity of collecting from shipwrecks, and that he wrote about it, and he obviously had fans who knew about it.
It is a lucky strike, because there are hundreds of letters that have been published between Wordsworth and the good and the great. Of course, we're talking about an era where you didn't have mobile phones or smartphones or emails or World Wide Web. You had to, get out your quill and write in ink. And fortunately, a lot of that communication has survived, and a lot of it has been published. Yet, only one letter speaks of this antiquities and his collecting mania. And it really is a lucky strike in that regard.
It also speaks of all those lost voices from the sea, which is one of the reasons why shipwreck material is so important, that it throws another series of stories onto our laps for us to look at. Just like pieces that come from the sea have voices and tell us a great deal. So all of a sudden, we are actually privileged to be able to see what those voices meant to those who were suffering as well.
So from the depth of the ocean to the depth of William Wordsworth's soul. So Rex Cowan, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us.
You're very welcome.
So to the list of amazing poems that William Wordsworth left to the world, we now know, here an exclusive on Wreckwatch, that he tried to deal with the death of his brother, Commander John, by collecting shipwrecked artifacts. Things salvaged from ships that had sunk let him keep the memory of his beloved brother alive, and in a very hands-on way, to find some therapy to live with his deep psychological scars. Today, around 2,000 objects recovered from the wreck of the Earl of Abergavenny can be seen in Portland Museum in Dorset, England. The old ship was heavily salvaged starting in 1805 and throughout the 19th century. Much later in 1999, the Weymouth Underwater Archaeological Group, headed by Ed Cummings, found plenty of finds left behind over a decade of diving. The fascinating collection ranges from cannonballs to pocket watches and clay tobacco pipes to dominoes, most of them recently modelled in 3D using photogrammetry by volunteers from Portland Museum. William Wordsworth never got his hands on any sunken finds from the Abergavenny, so he had to make do with mementos salvaged from other shipwreck tragedies. Those physical reminders of things that could be saved were props that kept the memory of Commander John burning in his soul, alongside the words he eventually immortalized about the tragedy. All vanished in a single word, a breath, a sound, and scarcely heard. Sea, ship, drowned, shipwreck, so it came. The meek, the brave, the good was gone. He who had been our living John was nothing but a name. To read much more about the wreck of the Earl of Abergavenny, hop on over to get hold of the August 2023 issue of Wreckwatch Magazine, hot off the press and free when you subscribe on our homepage. For more groundbreaking and exclusive stories from Wreckwatch TV, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, ping that notification bell, and stay tuned.